Welcome to this evening's seminar. So my name is Dr. Aram Kim. I'm a consultant psychiatrist of Korean descent. I just want to give a couple of acknowledgements. My colleague, Dr. Susan Lane, who's a consultant psychiatrist, allow me to use her fantastic slides. I also want to acknowledge Reconnect for organising this online seminar. I just want to make some declarations. I have absolutely no conflicts of interest whatsoever on this topic, in the sense that I've got no affiliation with political parties, and I also have no affiliation with any pro or against lobby groups on this issue. By the way, my apologies, because my youngest child is constantly coming in and out of the room, and that's all the noises. What I'm hoping to do today is talk a little bit about effects of cannabis, a range of legislative options that are available when thinking about cannabis reform, and the arguments for and against them. And I guess what I bring to this is a more health and Asian perspective, and just a slide to give a bit of a harm reduction message on cannabis, which I think we should all consider whether the law changes or not. So what are the effects? In small doses, it can relax the user, can sort of instill a feeling of well-being and sort of on the high. But it can also make people struggle to concentrate. It can increase the appetite. It can impair balance and coordination, increase heart rate, and makes the eye bloodshot. There are a number of long-term effects. Some will argue there's a medicinal benefit. We'll come back to that later. Hormonal imbalance that are associated with lower libido and infertility. Interestingly, there's an emergence of this syndrome called cannabis hyperemesis. This is sort of unstoppable vomiting that happens in heavy users when they stop. And then there are obviously respiratory, so lung effects, so infections like bronchitis, infections and inflammations of your lung and the windpipes. So again, in terms of kind of harm of cannabis, especially psychiatric, this is mental health related harm. There's obviously dependence, so people can physically become dependent, addicted to it. And that there's acute effects. So when you use it, especially in high potency or like really high strength, it can cause short-term memory to be impaired, attention and concentration. People can experience anxiety, paranoia, and psychosis. Beyond the kind of acute effect, the short-term effect of cannabis may include impairment in your cognitive function, that is your intellectual function. Some of it may be reversible. However, if you use high amount, especially from young age, the impairment it causes, damage it causes to your intellectual ability may not be reversible. Even if you stop, it doesn't come back. It's also associated with increased risk of schizophrenia, especially again, using regularly high amount from young age. Cannabis use is very wide and very prevalent. One figure from 2017 suggests that over 188 million people across the world use cannabis. And if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that general trend is going up. It's important to note Asia is about 2%, and in Australia is 18%, and New Zealand is very similar. It's about 15 to 18%. 2% in Asia seems like a very small amount, but in fact, if you think about the fact that 60% of world population reside in Asia, so the Asians, it actually means that 1/3 of people who use cannabis across the world are actually Asians. This means that the law reform may have a very different effect to Asians living in New Zealand compared to other ethnic groups in New Zealand. The greatest proportion of cannabis users are focused in young people. Also, more in men and more in Maori. Much lower rate in Asian. Now, it may be that this low rate of use of cannabis in Asian population may be due to the fact that this survey was done in English and this part of the survey was not done if the person needed interpreter. However, even if we consider that, I think what's really clear is the rate of people using cannabis in this population, the Asian population in New Zealand, is much lower than the general population. So let's look at the law side of things. Now this graph is from Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada. This is from 2014. This was made at the point when they were debating legalization. So when you look at the spectrum of law that may exist, on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's total prohibition. On the other side, it's completely legalized. And in between, there's legalization with strict regulation. So we'll talk about that. So where are we in New Zealand? Well, we are at this stage where in total prohibition section. But some countries have decriminalized it. So what it means is that people who are growing it and supplying it, it's still illegal to do that. However, people who are in possession of small amount for personal use, they're not going to be charged by police as a criminal offense. And what we're looking at in New Zealand, the bill that are in front of us at the moment, on which a referendum is being carried out, we're looking at legalizing cannabis with very strict regulation. Now, it means that manufacturing, sales, possession, and use of cannabis are all legal, but the government maintains tight control over the cannabis market by a variety of means. As far as the public health goes, that you can minimize the social and health harms by legalizing it and yet control it very, very strictly. We kind of need to think about what law means. So having a law means essentially a boundary between what is acceptable behavior and what's not. So when we prohibit something, it conveys to society that it's not a desirable thing to do. So in the case of cannabis, prohibition law conveys a very strong message that cannabis manufacture, sales, and use is just unacceptable and it'll be punished. In this context, then you can make an assumption that that means if we legalize it, then we're giving a message to society that it's okay to use. But I think the biggest factor for people who are supporting this is that we know, because we know how things are, when we change it, we really don't know what's going to happen. And some people argue, say, well, that's not great, that's not good enough. People have been using it quite widely, and in fact, overall the rate has been increasing. Therefore, this current law does not work. Therefore, we should change it. Especially if we think about the most vulnerable people, that is young people and high users, making it illegal, like as it is now, has not worked for them. It has not deterred them, stopped them from using it. The current system, current law does not really protect them. Also, one of the biggest arguments for change has been that criminalization causes social harm. People, when they get, for example, charged, they not only lose their job, they may lose future opportunity for employment, education opportunities, and so on and so forth. And there are inequities that exist around arrest, prosecution, and sanctions against cannabis locally, but also internationally. Some of you may be aware that when the US federal government proclaimed so-called war on drugs from the 1970s onwards, it disproportionately targeted African Americans. The criminalization of use of cannabis may affect certain groups more so, even though they use the same amount, for example. Because it's illegal, we cannot really get public health campaigns around this use, because people just say, well, this is illegal, no one should be using it. Whereas, for example, with tobacco, it's legal, but because it's tightly controlled, we can do public health campaigns on the harms. Same thing with alcohol. So making it legalized or decriminalized, that may then open up these venues. So how things are in New Zealand is that since the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1975, we know that under this law, that possession of cannabis can carry a maximum sentence of 3 months imprisonment or $500 fine. If you're carrying 28 grams or more, or 100 joints or more, presumption is that you're carrying it for supply, and dealing cannabis carries a maximum penalty of 14 years, and cultivation, this is growing cannabis, have a maximum penalty of 7 years. The number of people who've been convicted with cannabis offences have been dropping. It's still high though. In 2019, there are 3,000 people per year. In terms of the argument, staying with the prohibition has been around the cost. Now, New Zealand Drug Harm Index of 2016, so this study estimated the social cost of drug-related harms and intervention is about $1.8 billion in 2014 to 2015. A lot of that is related to cannabis or cannabinoids here. Now, this is the important part. We talked about the racial inequity that exists. The percentage of people convicted with cannabis offences by ethnicity, the dark orange line is the European, the grey line is Maori. The Maori communities are disproportionately impacted. New Zealand population-wise, we think about Maori population consisting about 17%. The percentage of people convicted with a cannabis offence for Maori is about close to 50%. So it means the rate of police contact is 3 times higher for Maori than non-Maori, which is not explained by differences in offending. So just to reiterate that Maori were 3 times more likely to be arrested and convicted of a cannabis-related crime than non-Maori. And Maori were almost twice as likely as non-Maori to go to court over first offence, and nearly 7 times more likely to be charged. As a society, we're producing this inequity, even if we say the cannabis is illegal. By legalizing cannabis, it may cause positive implication for social equity outcomes for Maori. Legalizing it may actually reduce that social harm that may come from unconscious racial bias. And I'm just going to highlight the fact that the current referendum is about recreational use of cannabis, nothing to do with medicinal cannabis. Cannabis for medical purposes is an entirely separate issue from recreational use. and we should not conflate that. Having said that, at the same time, there is actually a significant overlap between recreational and medicinal use. Some people then say that we should actually just decriminalize it. This will lead to reducing criminalization, that reduce the cost of enforcement, like the policing cost and justice cost. And evidence seems to suggest that decriminalizing doesn't seem to increase use or dependence. People who are against this idea suggest that even if you decriminalize it and reduce that social harm that are related with making people criminal, but around use of cannabis, the market still is unregulated. The people who are using are not really directed to prevention or treatment, and still the risk around police discretion exists. Therefore, the social harm that are caused from kind of the unconscious racial bias can still persist. Within the model of legalization, so it means that it's no longer criminal, no longer illegal to grow, supply or sell or use. And the idea is that by legalizing, it'll reduce or at least potentially get rid of the illicit market that are usually run by organized crime groups like gangs. And again, the argument is that it may produce income in the form of tax and levy and increase the opportunity for health interventions to occur. People who are against the idea of legalization sense that it sends the wrong message and it may lead to increased access and use, and because the private sector will be growing and selling groups or these companies to maximize profit, they'll be lobbying for greater access to influence or increase use. And some argue that legalizing can lead to increased harm, psychosis, and motor vehicle accident. It's also clear that evidences suggest that there is an increased rate of motor vehicle accidents related to cannabis use as well. Even in the legalization model, there's two different models. There's a model, like a North American model, which is regulated commercial market. So the private companies run these businesses, but they're regulated by the government laws. But there's also Uruguay model, where government has a monopoly on cannabis sales. So the bill that we're facing in New Zealand, the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill, it says that manufacturing, purchase and use are restricted to 20 years and over. Purchase and possession quantities are limited, as 14 grams. You can only use it in private, your own home, or licensed premises. You can't use it in public spaces. You can only grow 2 plants per person or maximum of 4 plants per house. Advertising is prohibited. It's going to be completely regulated and the product will be taxed, and there will be a licensing regime and agency, and there is a cap put on legal quantity available for sales and business so that the market does not just grow and grow and grow. So the question that you will be voting on is that, do you support the proposed Cannabis Legalization and Control Bill? If the referendum results in more than 50% of voters saying yes, it'll lead to next government, incoming government, introducing bills to Parliament, and then they will discuss this further and finalise it. Cannabis is still a substance that can be addictive and it does cause harm. So there's no such thing as safe use. As a population, abstinence is the only way to completely guarantee avoidance of health risk associated with cannabis use. But if people are using, delaying the use till they're older, limiting the use or reducing the use, frequency of use is helpful. Shifting away from smoking to something like vaporizers may be safer because of the kind of effect on the lung. Less potent, obviously, is safer as well. And again, people with the highest risk of cannabis-related problems are people who have family history of psychosis or cardiovascular problems, and obviously pregnant women. These people really should abstain altogether. So in summary, the proposed Cannabis Legalization and Control Bill tries to address multiple health, social, and justice issues through the reformation of the cannabis-related law. So it's not just health issues, it's not just social issue or justice issues. We're trying to address all of these issues in one go. And ultimately, what I believe is that it'll be up to you, your own values, or what's important, to decide how you want to vote. So for example, you might be really, really concerned about social injustice, racial inequities, and those people who are most vulnerable, the young, the Maori, poor, and you might think on the heavy or regular users, and you think, actually for those groups, this legalization and control bill may actually reduce harm across the population, therefore I support this. However, what's also interesting, and it probably hasn't been talked about a lot, is that for Asians, I think in New Zealand, for whom there's a really low prevalence, low rate of cannabis use, this law can also have a very different impact. It may in fact increase use in our group as well. So this is again something to think about. I think what the bill is trying to achieve, as I mentioned, is about reducing social and health related harms. So have a read, have a think about it. I don't think it's a simple yes or no. I think there's a lot of issues you have to grapple with and apply your values to understand and decide how you want to vote.